So, welcome everyone to MarshWatch. This is the first installation in this webinar series, and today we're mostly going to be talking about the wonder of wetlands. Sure, I'm on the right screen. But before we get started, I'd like to say that I'm joining you today from Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and encompasses the homeland and the traditional territory of the Cree, the Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. On the agenda for tonight, I'm going to give a quick little introduction about myself. Then we will dive right into the wonder of wetlands. And then we're going to talk about MarshWatch as the program that you guys are joining in on. And I'll have some contact info after that. Then I'm going to stop the recording and we can move into discussions and questions. And I'll have a little questionnaire, mostly because I'm curious to get to know the audience a little bit. So my name is Leanne Latremoy, and I love wetlands. That probably sounds really corny because this is my job and I'm getting paid to do this, but I really do truly love wetlands. And I've been fortunate enough to get to spend a lot of time getting to know wetlands up close and personal throughout my career. I actually got started in 2008 surveying wetlands in Southern Ontario. I work for an organization called Birds Canada, and we're a nonprofit organization with a mission to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds in Canada. I'm pretty fortunate to be able to do that as a living, and here's a smattering of photos of me in one of my favorite habitats of all time. In this bottom left-hand corner in 2021, this is actually me choosing to walk through a wetland because I was tired of walking through the swampy, clogged forest in the Boreal. So I do love wetlands, and even when I'm not doing wetland surveys, I do sometimes like to get my feet mucky. So it's a little bit about me, but let's dive right into the wonder of wetlands. And this right here is one of my favorite marshes of all time. And if you hop in my imaginary canoe, we're going to take a short cruise through this wetland. And I want you to just maybe, if you're comfortable doing it, close your eyes for just a second as we glide into this nice little area and take a listen to all of the bird sounds that are around us. Now, hopefully you'll be hearing a wonderful birdie soundscape. All right, getting the thumbs up. That's what I like to hear. So these are all the species that you're hearing on this recording. So wetlands are really fabulous places for biodiversity, as we're going to get into, but just listening to that, it's kind of incredible just how much life is packed into sometimes these really small areas, and they're really fascinating to me, and I hope to share that with you as well. So you might be wondering, what exactly is a wetland? What is this space that we're inhabiting in our mind right now? Well, wetlands are really that in-between space. They're a transition habitat between water and dry land. They're not quite a lake. They're not upland dry land either. You definitely want some, rubber boots or chest waders, or, even a canoe or a kayak to get through them. They're these fascinating transitional habitats, and that means that you get all sorts of critters that are from the upland dryland and the water as well. Wetlands are characterized by having poorly drained soils, and they support plants and animals that are adapted to this kind of unique wet environment. We have many types of wetlands here in Saskatchewan and in Canada as well. Further north, you'll run into bogs and fens. Fens are also known as muskeg. These are really peaty areas. They've got that spongy material in them, and they're really kind of dense places with very little open water for the most part. We've also got treed and shrubby swamps, and this is probably as idyllic as it gets. Right here, here's a little bit of a shrubby swamp up on the Athabasca area, and this is as nice as it gets. You know, it looks pretty lovely, but for the most part, a lot of these treed swamps are pretty dense. They're pretty mucky in the understory, and they also support an incredible diversity of life. But we're really going to be talking about the freshwater marshes here in this series. And these are areas that are periodically inundated with standing or slow moving water for periods of time. If you zoom out on the Canadian prairie landscape, you might notice that, holy smokes, there are a lot of these wetlands, and it's actually a really incredible thing to behold. If you're from the prairies and you haven't been to the rest of Canada, say, you might be surprised to find that there aren't quite as many wetlands like this in the rest of the country. And if you're tuning in from elsewhere, this would be a really spectacular place to visit if you like wetlands at all, because we really have an incredible amount of them. But why are there so many on the prairies? How did they get here? And why are they all these little kind of dots on the landscape that are wet? Well, it all has to do with the last ice age. And more precisely, it has to do with the meltdown of the last ice age. See, when the glaciers that covered this area started receding about 10,000 years ago, they didn't recede in a nice, orderly fashion. The glaciers broke off into chunks, leaving great big icebergs behind, floating in some of that water and sediment. And those icebergs kind of just sat there like ice cubes in the landscape, and sediment filled in around them. And as they slowly melted, they left behind these depressional basins called the prairie potholes. And so they left chunks all over the place. And this is why our landscape here on the prairies is dotted with all of these small, unconnected, shallow basins. Some of them are quite large, but a great majority of them are quite small. And so this is why we have that incredible landscape that you see. Just like this, all of these different sizes, all of these wetlands all over the place. It's pretty incredible. And this whole area is known as the prairie pothole region, and it covers quite a large swath of the Canadian prairies, as well as North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, and a little bit of Montana. But as you can see, where I am in Saskatchewan, it covers a whole large part of the province. And this area is colloquially known as North America's duck factory, because all of these millions of wetland basins support about 50% of North America's breeding waterfowl population, which is pretty incredible to think about. If you like ducks, you should definitely come visit the prairies. And if you're fortunate enough to live here, you should really, just love what you have. It is an incredible place. So you might wonder, what have wetlands ever done for me? Why are wetlands important? Wetlands act as a sponge to absorb floodwater, they recharge groundwater, and they also purify it as they go. The wetlands, especially on larger lake systems and in streams, they prevent shoreline erosion. So they buffer that kind of wave action that you can get with the wind stirring things up. So it helps protect that shoreline from eroding into the basin. They also do a really good job of sequestering carbon. And one of the defining features of wetlands is that peaty base to the bottom. If you've ever walked out into a wetland, you'll notice that it's very, very squishy, very spongy. You sink down a fair bit. It's not like walking out into a nice, hard, or even a slightly squishy lake bed. It's quite a bit different. It's very organic, and it might even smell kind of funny too. So they sequester carbon through all of that peat accumulation on the bottom. And they also provide food and essential habitat for a wide variety of animals, including fish, shellfish, water birds, land birds, and mammals. But they're also important for humans, for food and resources, including things like wild rice, cranberries, fish, game, and plant roots. So wetlands do a whole lot for us, and we're going to get into that in a little bit here. I thought this was a really great diagram from Ducks Unlimited Canada. And if we pay attention to that area just below the water surface here, that's that peat layer that I was mentioning. That's the part that really acts as the sponge and sequesters all of that carbon. It's all of that dead plant material that doesn't quite decompose. And that area acts as a sponge. So when it dries out, it releases some of the water. But when the water comes back in, it can really inflate and take over some of that water storage capacity. So they're really, really incredible places for the landscape, and they really help. What's interesting is that this technology, this process can even be used by humans to clean wastewater. So the town of Walnut Cove in North Carolina actually took the wetland design and made it their their wastewater treatment center. So here's a diagram of it, and in the first stages it goes through some bacterial decomposition, and in the end they force the water through this cattail bed, which further purifies their wastewater, which is just a really interesting use of the natural capacity of wetlands to purify and clean the drinking water. So here in Saskatchewan, we go through some pretty extreme wet and dry cycles. And if you've been living on the prairies, you'll know that it's definitely been dry the last few years. And this isn't the first time that that's happened. This is a normal cyclic thing. I just thought I would show you some of the satellite imagery, and this is from out by near Prudhomme in Saskatchewan in 2002. It's a pretty dry area, or dry time of year for this satellite imagery. But 10 years later, boy, was it ever a fair bit more wet. And you can just see all of those small basins that didn't show up on the map anymore are suddenly full of water. And this landscape level, wet and dry expansion and contraction of these wetlands is a natural cycle, and it's part of what makes these places so prolific and so great for wildlife. I'll just go back and forth a little bit so you can see some of those wetland basins. Some of them were still there and looking the same, but a lot of the more shallow ones that wind up getting cropped in dry years fill right up again and start those wetland processes. It's always better if they weren't cropped on the bottom, but we do live on the prairies and that does happen. Here's an example of what that looks like on the ground. So this is a fairly recently flooded basin, probably had been flooded for a few years, and you can see some of those wetland plants starting to creep in and all of these cattails on the side. There's no dead cattail materials. These are all pretty recent additions to that landscape. So this is what a more recently flooded landscape can look like. And on the flip side of that, even these really large basins can really dry out in those dry years. And this is a normal part of the cycle. This helps keep the plant communities healthy. If the water stays down for long enough, you'll get all kinds of little plants coming up that are more of those shallow wetland plants and not those deep water ones. The deep water ones will die out, but that's part of the renewal process that these wetlands go through. So it's pretty incredible to be out in a landscape that has such dramatic changes to it. As humans, I think we like to see stuff looking the same year after year, but wetlands are really variable by nature, especially here on this prairie ecosystem. So even those large basins dry up. All of that kind of fluctuation really makes for interesting habitat for wildlife. There's a lot of habitat heterogeneity. There's a lot of different kinds of wetlands on the landscape, and all of that makes for great habitat for all kinds of species. Here's some examples of lots of bird species that nest directly in or above or right next to a lot of these wetland systems. So if you look in the top left-hand corner, black terns and eared grebes practically lay their eggs in the water. They're only built up a very little bit with some wet vegetation in that marsh. Whereas on the other hand, we've got marsh wrens over on the upper right-hand side that build this globe nest securely above the water, nowhere near the water, that they hover over it. It was pretty amazing to see the diversity of birds that nest in and around these wetlands. And even the ones that don't nest right within the wetlands, like a lot of the dabbling ducks, which will nest in the upland habitat, will make a perilous journey with their kids to get to the nearest wetland, because these are really critical brooding habitats for them. These wetlands oftentimes are fishless. They're small, a lot of them are small, unconnected basins that in the wintertime will freeze all the way to the bottom, and so fish can't actually live in them. And if there's no fish, That means there's not a lot of predators for a lot of the small insects and macroinvertebrates that live in the water. And so they can be really, really productive systems, especially if you're trying to feed a whole brood full of little ducklings. So these habitats are really important for species that we, think of as wetland species, but they may nest elsewhere and will come and feed on the bonanza. And speaking of the bonanza, this is an incredible picture that I only encountered this once, and these are amphipods. Here's an up-close picture of them, also known as scuds. And these are small little invertebrates that live in the water. And this area of this wetland didn't have any fish in them, and just these amphipods went nuts. So you can imagine the feeding frenzy that birds and other wildlife will have when all of this biomass is available for them to eat. So these wetlands are very, very important, especially for raising young. They're also really important for birds that only use them maybe a couple of days out of the year. And a good example of this are these Arctic nesting migratory shorebirds. So these birds will use wetlands, mudflats, various states along their migration routes as super important refueling stops. They really love those shallow areas and those mudflats to poke their bills in and get at all the yummy little critters. So here's just some examples of shorebirds using wetlands in the province as they refuel on their way up. We might only see them for a couple of days in the season, but that doesn't mean that these wetlands aren't critically important to them. There's all kinds of other critters that use wetlands as well, not just birds, and some of them use them periodically, some of them make them their homes, like the muskrat. The mink is actually a weasel that is semi-aquatic and spends a fair bit of its life in wetlands, but on the upper right-hand corner, you can see some coyote tracks, even a coyote pup, as well as fresh raccoon tracks. So these are critters that are going to go visit a wetland kind of, to grab a bite to eat because they're super productive areas. Moose will also use them, and there's a large number of insect larvae that rely on wetlands for the larval stage. Damselflies, dragonflies being some of the more obvious examples. We also have fish in some of these larger systems as well, and you might not think that the pike is really going to rely on shallow wetlands, but these guys actually go up into the shallow areas of the lake's margins in the vegetation and lay their eggs. They often do this in areas that are no longer going to be wet in the middle of summer. I've actually seen in a flooded year, I've seen a pike about that size crossing a flooded road because it was going over to lay eggs in a flooded field. It didn't end terribly well because that was a kind of an exceptional flood, but it was amazing to see that the pike would cross something like that to get into these flooded grassy areas to go lay their eggs. So you might not think of wetlands as being important for things like fish, but they definitely are, especially in Saskatchewan. We'll see a little bit later as well. I mentioned earlier that some of these insects can be really prolific, and I'm sure most of you have encountered midge hatches in your time, especially if you've been driving around, you get these covering your windshield, or if you have a cottage next to a lake, sometimes in the hatch, you'll just get these incredible masses of them on the sides of your cottage. These are the things that look like mosquitoes, but don't actually bite and bother you. They're pretty harmless. But they make these massive hatches. They all kind of come out at the same time. And this provides a really important food resource for aerial insectivores like tree swallows, purple martins, and others. And this is a guild of birds that are in pretty steep decline. And so you think about, they're relying on these food sources that are coming from these wetlands. So the wetlands are super important for that reason. So it gives them their food source, but it also provides food for birds that you might not expect, like this mallard duckling or this Franklin's gull, both photographed here, actually going after midges on the hatch. So it's pretty incredible that even some of these smaller bodied insects are really important food sources for all kinds of different species. Another interesting one is a little bug called the water boatman. And this seemingly innocuous little bug actually goes and connects to very different systems. So it spends its summer breeding and, making babies in small wetlands. And some species in the fall will migrate to river systems en masse. I'm talking in the millions of them. They will pour into the river system, where they actually become really important food resource for fish over the wintering season. When spring comes, they'll crawl out and they will fly over and find another wetland and start the whole process over again. And it's pretty incredible. You wouldn't think that a small, shallow wetland basin is actually going to be important for fish in a river system miles and miles away, but it turns out there's more connections than we realized in some of these systems. So they are pretty incredible. Other species of water boatmen just freeze into the ice, which is also an amazing feat. A lot of insects do that. A lot of the larvae that spend the winter, they can't fly away. They don't have wings. These guys actually do. And so it's incredible that, they can freeze solid into this ice and thaw out in the summer. Some species like this one do avoid it and become important food sources, tying these places together, which I think is pretty incredible. And if you're interested in the wetland critters that you can't see or hear very easily, one thing you can do is pond dipping. And if you have kids in your life, I would highly recommend doing this. It is a ton of fun. Get yourself a fine mesh net of some sort and a bucket, say an ice cream pail, and take up a couple of scoops of whatever, stuff you can under the wetland and put it into that bucket and just take a look. You might be surprised at the kind of critters that you might find. I've got a short video here of some wetland critters that we actually found here in Saskatchewan. So there's some fairy shrimp, there's some cyclops, there's some damselfly larvae in there, there's clam shrimp and tadpole shrimp. I think these are pretty incredible little wetland critters that normally you don't get to see at all. So I highly recommend going for a pond dip if you can at some point. Like I said, especially if you have kids, there's nothing that kids like more usually than, staring at a bunch of wetland critters that they were able to find themselves. I know I liked doing it in my swimming pool in the springtime, so a real wetland would be a pretty nice treat. So let's keep going on our little boat journey. We've been in this wetland for a little bit of time now. We'll change gears a little bit and we'll talk about what's coming up in MarshWatch. So this is a pilot program. We haven't run this before, so a lot of this is new, and I'm sure the second time around it's going to be even better. But we're going to be going through amphibians and birds by sight and sound, kind of at a slow pace so that you have time to learn them and you're not overwhelmed. And also I'm hoping that you're going to gain some appreciation for wetlands, because I really do think that they're fascinating habitats and they're super important for the landscape as a whole, as well as birds and critters. So there's going to be weekly webinars. They'll be recorded. We're also going to do some quizzes. So during the webinar, we'll have some visual quizzes, but there'll also be quizzes posted online, and those will have a mix of visual and audio clues. So do look out for those. We will be doing some guided walks at predetermined locations, as well as a few locations based on vote. So at some point, I'm going to come up with a good system to get folks to vote on where they might like to have me out for a weekend bird walk. And the overall goal of this program is to submit a checklist from a wetland in July. So that can be any wetland of your choosing, any time of day. Early morning is a better time generally, but if you want to get out there in the afternoon and, collect your checklist, go for it. That is totally fine. This is meant to be a pretty casual program, and I mostly want to get folks interested and, caught up with some of the local bird species that they're likely to be seeing. This program does act as a bit of a stepping stone for the Marsh monitoring program, which is going to return to Prairie Canada in 2024. It's been going on for quite some time in Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, and BC. So if you're tuning in from those locations and you don't participate, you might be interested in joining next year as well in those locations. But the Marsh monitoring program is a much more formal survey where you go to designated locations at early times of the morning or evening. And this is, MarshWatch is just going to be a much more casual program. Most of you have seen the webinar schedule. Today we're doing the Wonder of Wetlands. The next session we're going to cover a little bit of basics of bird ID and the first ID session, and then we'll go through, do a bunch more ID sessions. We'll have a review session on July 5th where we'll go over all of the tricky species and any questions that you might have. And on the 12th, we'll do a bit of a program wrap up. We'll summarize any results that we have and just chit chat about wetlands. During those ID sessions, we're going to cover about 6 to 8 bird species, about 48 birds in total. We'll do ID by sight and sound. I'll talk about their habitat preferences and some cool facts about each one of them. We'll also cover 1 to 2 amphibian species, so we'll do roughly about 8 frogs and toads, and we'll also do the ID by sight and sound for those guys as well. We'll also have review quizzes and discussions and questions at the end of each session. And we're going to be covering all of these species. So I know there's going to be a lot of folks tuning in from the prairies, and that's great. These are all going to be relevant for you. If you're tuning in from elsewhere, some of these species are going to be a bit Western Canada specialist, but a lot of these species are going to be really relevant to lots of places in Canada. So if you're tuning in from elsewhere, that's great. You're still going to learn a lot as well, and it'll still be quite useful. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. And just a heads up, I've got a cancellation plan in place because I do suffer from pretty bad migraines, and sometimes I might have to cancel a webinar. So what's going to happen if that is the case, I'm going to try to do my best not to. I'm going to send a cancellation email out as soon as possible, and I'm going to reschedule the webinar for the next Friday at 7 p.m., so 2 days after. And you'll get a reminder email 1 hour before that one. If you can't make it, I totally understand. You've signed up for Wednesdays, so it will be posted online soon after as well. So I just wanted to put that in place in case the need arises. But before we wrap up our little wetland session, I just want to do one more little listen to a wetland. And this one is actually taken at 2 o'clock in the morning. And this kind of highlights some of the things that I find really interesting about wetlands is that they are surprisingly active at night. Most of these species are active throughout the day, and some of them are even more active at night than they are during the day. So just give a quick little listen at about 30 seconds here of this wetland recording. So the idea for this program is that by the end of this, most of these birds are going to be familiar to you, if not all of them. So it'll be really interesting, I think, to go from maybe not really knowing what you're hearing to being able to identify the birds that you're hearing. It's almost like a superpower, and I'm excited to share that with you guys. Oh, maybe that didn't trim as much as I thought. We went for the whole minute. Okay, well, with that, I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in. Here's my contact information. The link to the website where all of the recordings are going to be posted is birdscanada.org/birdscience/MarshWatch. It's harder to say than I thought it would be. You can follow Birds Canada on all of the socials, and a big thank you to our supporters of this program, the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, as well as the Government of Canada.